Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. REEI houses the Russian Studies Workshop, which is a research and training hub in Russian studies, launched at IU in 2016, thanks to generous funding from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this Russian Studies Workshop panel on Soviet foreign relations and the late Cold War. This is the second in our panel series, Critical Conversations in Russian Studies. And we want to thank our co-sponsor for this afternoon's panel, the Department of International Studies in the Hamilton Lugar School at Indiana University. In February, the first panel in this series focused on the state of human rights in Russia today. You can find a recording of that panel, that important conversation, on our website at rsw.indiana.edu. We will also drop a link to that in the chat for those who are on the Zoom call. And I will quickly mention that the next panel in the Critical Conversations series will take place on April 16th. That panel will focus on promoting inclusion and appreciating diversity in today's Russia, with a focus on disability rights issues in Russia. And again, we'll drop a link in the chat for you to access information on that panel. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Lizzie Patterson, an undergraduate student at the Hamilton Lugar School, who will introduce today's panelists.
Thank you so much, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Lizzie Patterson, and I'm a senior here at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies, majoring in International Studies. I am pleased to introduce to you today the panelists who will be leading this discussion, and also our moderator, Professor Michael de Groot. Michael de Groot is an assistant professor in the International Studies Department at HLS. His research focuses on the international, diplomatic, and economic history of the Cold War. His articles have appeared in the Journal of Cold War Studies, an international journal, and he is currently completing his book on the political economy of the end of the Cold War. Moving on to our panelists. First, Fritz Bartel is an associate professor for the Department of International Affairs at Texas A&M University's Bush School of Government and Public Service. His research includes U.S. foreign relations and the global Cold War, grand strategy, and the history of capitalism. His book, The Triumph of Broken Promises, The End of the Cold War and the Rise of Neoliberalism, is forthcoming with Harvard University Press. Susan Colbourn is a DAAD postdoctoral fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Colbourn is a diplomatic and international historian focusing on the history of NATO and the Cold War and the role of nuclear weapons therein. Colbourn is working on two books currently, the first being an international history of the Cold War and NATO, and the second is a brief history of NATO's enlargement in the 1990s. Simon Miles is an assistant professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. Miles is a diplomatic historian with expertise on the Soviet Union and Russia. Recently, his book, Engaging the Evil Empire, Washington, Moscow, and the Beginning of the End of the Cold War, was published, exploring key US-Soviet relations between 1980 and 1985. Currently, he is working on his next project, An International History of the Warsaw Pact. And finally, Chris Miller is an assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and is the co-director of the school's Russia and Eurasia program. He's the author of Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia, and the Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy. His research includes Russian history and politics and Cold War history. I will now be handing the floor over to Professor Michael de Groot to lead our discussion.
Well, thanks very much, Lizzie, for the introduction. And I should note that Lizzie's writing a simply wonderful capstone thesis on the new Lugar Act, the Non-Lugar Act. So I know she has quite a lot to teach us about the Cold War, the end of the Cold War herself. Thanks as well to Sarah Phillips and Tatiana Saburova in the Russian Studies Workshop, as well as Purnima Bose in the Department of International Studies for sponsoring this event. And I know all the panelists are quite grateful to Sarah Fogelman and Lisa Bidwell for making this panel run so smoothly. So today we're going to be talking about the end of the Cold War, a topic that has doubtlessly attracted a tremendous amount of scholarly attention since the events themselves. The challenges are quite formidable in writing about the end of the Cold War. One must balance structural forces and human agency, juggle a really dizzying number of state and non-state actors, as well as have knowledge of the requisite languages. And archival access tends to be rather inconsistent, not just on the Soviet bloc side, but also in the West. I went to the US National Archives in College Park for one of my first archival research trips. When I was writing my dissertation, I told the archivist that I was interested in material on international economic affairs during the 1970s. And he simply laughed and said, good luck, those are not processed. And I can tell you that's not exactly what a third year PhD student wanted to hear. But fortunately, we have 4 terrific scholars with us today to help us understand the contours of the final 2 decades of the Cold War. And I'm delighted to welcome you all, if only virtually, to Bloomington. I should also say I'm quite excited to see such a good turnout, particularly among students. And I think it's a tribute to the level of intellectual engagement with Russian and Eastern European affairs across the university. And it's great to see you. The plan is to have a conversation, rather informal, until about 1 p.m. or so, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience, both through chat as well as through the raising your hand function in Zoom. But Fritz, I'd like to start with you. In writing about the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, one of the challenges is figuring out exactly where to begin. And so many works on the end of the Cold War begin with Gorbachev's rise to power in the mid-1980s. But your project is a little bit different and suggests that it's really the 1970s that was the decade of change. So why do we need to begin there?
Yes, thank you, Michael, and thank you to Sarah and Lisa and to the Russian Studies Workshop and to all of you for coming out today. This is a great sign for those of us who study the late Cold War that interest remains strong. So it's very nice to see. It's a great question, and as historians, we always struggle to find the right starting point. I think the 1970s is an important decade and the right decade in which to begin this conversation, because it is, as many historians now recognize, a decade of profound global change in many different realms. And the Soviet Union kind of stood in ironic position to these changes because in many ways, initially it looked like these changes would be helpful and would be advantageous to the Soviet Union. And it turned out that they were in fact the sources of challenge and ultimately of demise for the communist bloc. So if we think about issues of security, we can point to the rise of nuclear parity between the 2 blocs, a source of profound security for the Soviet Union and for the communist bloc. As that starts to develop, the United States and the West begins a new generation of military competition that ultimately proves very difficult for the Soviet Union to keep up with and to compete with. So just as it achieves this moment of security for itself, the terms of the competition begin to change. And I think that's something that recurs across a number of dimensions. We think similarly in the realm of politics and human rights. The 1970s are the time of the Helsinki Accords and of détente, partially which grants the Soviet Union something that it long sought, which was recognition of Europe's borders, post-war borders. At the same time, it also recognizes human rights as something that the Soviet Union and the communist bloc will live up to and will try to uphold. And this, of course, provides many ways with which the West and dissidents within the bloc can kind of have leverage over the governments of the communist world. And that will prove very decisive in the 1980s. Finally, in the realm of economics, many scholars now point to this decade as a really profound time of change, a time when the capitalist system was changing to a significant degree. The Bretton Woods system was collapsing. There were 2 significant oil crises that were profoundly affecting the capitalist world. Initially, all of these looked to be changes that the Soviet Union would either benefit from because it was a major producer of oil and natural gas, and it had a system of centralized planning that appeared to kind of insulate it from the crises that were enveloping the capitalist world. But over time, and what we now know and what Soviet policymakers realized by the 1980s was that these challenges were precisely the ones that they were ultimately unable to meet. So if we think about Stephen Kotkin is famous for saying that the Soviet Union was able to put up a Rust Belt, but it was not able to take down its Rust Belt. It was not able to move from an industrial economy to a post-industrial economy. That challenge is, I think, the one that ultimately comes to define the communist world in the 1980s, defines the challenges that it faces, and that really comes out of the oil crisis and the economic crises of the 1970s. So I think in a number of different realms, and everyone else on this panel will be able to speak to these as well, we can see the decade of the 1970s as one that appears to provide the communist world, and specifically the Soviet Union, with areas of security and areas of advantage. And those, over time, those advantages either prove to be very fleeting or turn out to, in fact, be sources of weakness. And those sources of weakness will come to influence the end of the Cold War in a dramatic way.
Well, thanks very much, Fritz. I'd like to turn to Simon and ask a similar question, because in your terrific recent book, you situate, as you put it, the beginning of the end of the Cold War in the early 1980s. So Fritz gave us an explanation of why we should look at the 1970s as the decisive period. But you develop a different argument. Can you give us a sense of why you think it's the early 1980s that deserves our attention?
Yeah, so let me preface my remarks by saying, there's a wonderful line in Ian McEwan's book, novel, Enduring Love, which is a great book. It's no atonement, but what is? Where he talks about beginnings, and basically says something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing here, that all beginnings are artificial. What recommends one beginning over another beginning is how much explanatory power it has over what comes afterwards. And so, Fritz's argument makes a lot more sense by starting in the 1970s, I think, about borrowing and things like that. My argument is primarily focused on military balance of power. And so I was struck when I was working in the archives, in the Soviet archives, how optimistic they were in 1980. How pessimistic Ronald Reagan was in 1980, as he had been in 1976 when he ran against Jerry Ford for the nomination, and how in just 5 years, those basically flipped, right? The Soviets of 1985 are the pessimists, the Reaganauts of 1985 are the optimists. So to me, that made sense, in large part because I was curious about how we get that massive reversal of not only fortunes, but of perception, right? Of perceived balance of power. That to me was a really, really interesting puzzle. So to continue to abuse McEwan, the beginning that made the most sense to me was to pick the story up in 80, which was kind of the high point. 80, 81 was a high point of Soviet self-perception, which didn't mean that they weren't very aware of serious problems that they had. I'm not suggesting that they were pure optimists, but rather that it was really resonant to me in contrast with what happened just 5 years later. So as an author, in a sense, I was interested in a degree of parsimony of how kind of quickly that shift happened, or seemed to be happening to me from what I was finding in the archives. And then, in the book, and I won't belabor this point, I make the argument that it's that shift in perceived balance of power, which is a real driver of the events which we now call the end of the Cold War.
Yeah. Thanks very much. And Susie, you work on this time period as well, what some scholars have called the so-called Second Cold War. And today, the concept of a Second Cold War is thrown around quite a lot in the newspaper and can be a little confusing about whether or not they're referring to US tensions with Russia or China. But in our world, the Second Cold War refers to that period in the early years of the 1980s. And so I wonder if I might ask you to dig a little bit deeper into this concept of the Second Cold War, what exactly its causes were, and perhaps more importantly, whether you think it's a useful concept or a useful term to understand what's really driving international relations in the early 1980s.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It's a good question. And I think the terminology is often a confusing one, not just because of the contemporary mix-ups that can occur. I once saw a panel organized around the concept of the Second Cold War at an academic conference where there were accidentally people talking about 1983 and 2014 on the same panel, purely a mix-up, a function of the exact definitional problems you're talking about here. But if we think about the idea of a second Cold War as it was sort of fleshed out in the early 1980s, most prominently with Fred Halliday's 1983 book, The Making of the Second Cold War. That's often seen as the sort of genesis of this terminology. It speaks, I think, to a degree of profound change that happened in sort of the zeitgeist and the psyche of not just foreign policy analysts and politicians and policymakers, but just broadly citizens of the Western world, right? That the Cold War had returned in full force. So I often see in the writings of the day comparisons to the dangers of the 1950s, back to the height of the Cold War, these kinds of tropes. And so I think that this idea, I see it a lot in the rhetoric of contemporary actors, particularly in the anti-nuclear activists that I study and write about in my work on the Euro missiles. But as a scholar, I have a hard time with this terminology of the Second Cold War having any real explanatory power for the state of affairs in the early 1980s, because I think that it depends on how we understand détente in the 1970s. So if you felt or understood the détente of the 1970s as a break from the Cold War, from the competition of the 1950s, then I can see how the return of especially superpower competition in the early 1980s would be this second Cold War because the first one had ended. But if you think of détente, as I often do, as a continuation of Cold War competition, but just through different means and in different places, then the second Cold War sort of loses a lot of its explanatory power because the first Cold War never ended. But I think that it's critical to disaggregate, if I pick up on Simon's idea of perception and reality, between impressions of contemporaries and how we as scholars see it. So even if I, as a historian, maintain that there was no second Cold War, many of the contemporaries that I studied did, and that thinking shaped their attitudes and actions. And this is something, right, that drives protesters into the streets to speak out against NATO's plans to deploy new nuclear missiles in the early 1980s, as just one example.
Thanks very much. And Chris, if we could turn to your work, one of the common criticisms about some of the research on the Cold War is that it takes place too much in the diplomatic sphere and gives too little attention to developments at home. And so your book, The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy, looks quite deeply at the structural problems facing the Soviet Union. And so I'd like to ask if you could give us a better sense of what those domestic challenges were. What were those domestic challenges that faced Gorbachev and his predecessors? And perhaps what the nexus was between domestic policy and Soviet foreign policy.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think there were two main domestic challenges that the Soviet Union faced. One, which was more political, the other more technological and not fundamentally solvable by political means. The first was that the people that held power in the Soviet Union were people that benefited from the status quo. And this is something that's the case in many political systems. It's sort of a standard function of politics that when you accumulate power, you try to grab hold of the state apparatus and use it to benefit yourself. And then in doing so, you're able to fend off competitors. But the problem was worse in the Soviet Union than in the United States, in part because there wasn't an electoral system that would let you oust the leaders on a regular basis. There wasn't term limits. And in part because the state was the only way to get resources. So you had an even stronger incentive to grab hold of the state as opposed to grabbing hold of a private firm or starting your own business or anything like that. So there was a really strong incentive to make yourself a high-ranking bureaucrat. And once you were a high-ranking bureaucrat, there was a very strong incentive to stay in place and not let anyone oust you. And so what this meant was that there was a built-in opposition to change that ossified the Soviet bureaucracy over the course of the post-war decades. And this was visible in a really visceral sense in the fact that the leadership of the Soviet Union got older and older and older as the post-war decades dragged on. It sort of mirrors the United States today, where it's impossible to find anyone in power that was below the age of 75, a problem that we currently face. And this mattered because all of the 75-year-olds in charge of the Soviet Union were desperately trying to keep things exactly as they were, which meant that as a technological basis for economics changed, the economy didn't change. The same factories that were built in the 50s and 60s were kept running in the 70s and 80s, even if what they were producing was no longer relevant. This was one issue that prevented economic growth from happening in any sort of serious way in the 1980s. And so we saw the growth rate decline steadily every single decade of the post-war period, from really rapid rate actually in the 1950s and to a certain extent in the 1960s to basically something approaching zero throughout the 1980s. That numbers are sort of hard to be sure of. So that was one problem. The second problem was technological, and this is something that I've come to realize since writing my first book, so it doesn't play a major role in it, but that's that the Soviet Union was quite good at replicating technologies that were devised elsewhere. And that worked really well because in the 1950s and 60s, the key military technologies were relatively easy to replicate. And this sounds kind of surprising because the key military technologies the 50s and 60s were nuclear weapons and delivery systems. But it turns out that nukes actually aren't that hard to make, which is why North Korea can make them. The things that mattered a lot in the 1970s, and especially in the 80s and 90s, were far more complex to make. And as you look at how military systems developed, computers became far more important over the course of the period. And in particular, computer chips, which are the hard part along with software systems, became vastly more important. So if you look at what military technology was by the end of the 1980s, it was precision strike systems, it was GPS satellites, which are all very, very difficult to make, and which the Soviet Union and Russia today still struggles to produce. So in the war in Syria, for example, around 80% of the bombs that Russia's Air Force has dropped over the past 6 years have been not precision guided, which is sort of incredible given that in 1991, 30 years ago, the US war in Iraq was a war that in many ways was won thanks to precision guided weaponry. And so Russia basically missed this entire shift in military affairs because it wasn't able to produce this technology. And this is kind of surprising because we think of Sputnik and we think of Russia's nuclear arsenal. And at the time, people believed that Russia was more or less, the Soviet Union was more or less equivalent to the US in technological terms. And if you actually look at technological analyses from the time, the real experts didn't think that, but that was the popular view. But it became, I think, increasingly clear by the 70s and 80s that the really hard technology to replicate were things that the Soviet system simply wasn't able to do. Even though lots of smart Soviet physicists, the actual manufacturing was impossible. And so by the 1980s, Soviet computer technology was based on getting 5 or 8 year old versions of what IBM had produced, pilfering them out of the West and trying desperately to replicate them in the Soviet context. And that was a recipe for being constantly 5 to 8 years or even more behind in military technology too. And in the moment that's where you are, a superpower competition becomes impossible to sustain. So that's, I think, the second key factor that prevented the Soviet Union from staying up in the military competition.
Thanks very much. And Fritz, if we could turn to you. So Chris is discussing some of the structural problems that the Soviet economy faced. And so you, in your work, cast a wider geographic net and look at the ways in which domestic structural problems inherent in Marxist-Leninist economics interacted with structural changes in the global economy. So the first question I asked you was about why do we need to look to the 1970s as the decisive decade, and you illustrated for us what some of those structural changes were. So if we can complete the circle, so to speak, can you walk us through exactly how the structural failings of the Eastern European economies interacted with those structural economic changes on a global scale?
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. So I think there's a couple important kind of lines to draw from the economic crises of the 70s to the late 1980s. And if you're one of the important things to explain, of course, about the late 1980s is why the Soviet Union allows the revolutions in 1989 to happen. And I think what the economics tells us is that beginning with, particularly with the oil crisis of 1973, the material burden of its allies in the Eastern Bloc skyrockets dramatically because the price of oil has quadrupled on the world market, and it's selling its oil to the bloc at a fixed price within the communist world. The opportunity cost of continuing to support its allies increases dramatically almost overnight. Now, the Soviet Union tries over time to rectify that difference. It starts to raise prices within the bloc, but every time it does so, it institutes a rolling system to raise the price. But it knows that as it's doing that, it's furthering the economic crises that are at work within the Eastern Bloc. So there's always this trade-off for the leadership in Moscow between how much do we want to support our population in our own country at home, and how much do we want to prevent crises within our allies from occurring. So something like the Polish crisis of the 1980s, the early 1980s, this question comes up specifically for the leadership in Moscow. And what they ultimately decide is that their allies are no longer worth saving. They come to repeal what's known as the Brezhnev Doctrine internally. They don't announce this to the world, but they reach the conclusion that if a solidarity-led government were to arise in Poland, ultimately that would be something they would have to accept because the costs of continuing to support their allied leaders in these countries were no longer worth bearing. Now, of course, General Jaruzelski and the declaration of martial law in Poland saves them from having to kind of come to terms with that decision. But once that decision is made, the rest of the 1980s progress in a way where once Gorbachev comes to power, he makes this much more explicit, right? And he is actively telling his allies that he's now willing to let them go free in a sense because the Soviet Union is no longer willing to bear this burden, this material burden of supporting its allies. And so I think that crisis, the economic crises of the 1970s give rise to this choice, or make this choice much more distinct between what's good for the Soviet Union within its borders and what's good for its empire or its allies abroad. And that choice is ultimately resolved in the late 1980s with Gorbachev's choice to prioritize developments at home, and that in turn leads to or allows the crises in Central Europe and Eastern Europe to become the revolutions that they ultimately are. So that imperial choice for the Kremlin ultimately comes out of the 1970s.
That's quite interesting. And if I could ask you a follow-up, one of the things that's implicit in your description, your explanation of the so-called enigma of 1989 is something that has quite a lot to do with developments in global capitalism and American economic policy in particular. So we're thinking here in particular about the Volcker shock or the rapid appreciation of the dollar in the early 1980s. So do you think that that's a missed component of the literature that maybe we need to look a little bit more at the if we want to understand American contributions to the end of the Cold War, perhaps it lies in something as seemingly mundane as Federal Reserve interest rate policy, things that at first glance appear as second order foreign policy issues? Absolutely.
I think this was something it's much easier to see in retrospect than it seems to have been at the time. The global and international implications of the Federal Reserve's policies. So the fight against inflation within the United States, where Paul Volcker ultimately decides to let interest rates go to levels that they really had never been certainly in the post-war period. Of course, the first implication of that is for the domestic economy within the United States. But now we can see very clearly through archival documents in the Eastern Bloc that leaders around the bloc were viewing this as something that very much affected their own societies. Why it affected their own societies is because they had become dependent on borrowed money from the capitalist world. So one of the ways in which they tried to avoid the economic crises of the 1970s was a very natural response, is to try to borrow money and kind of push off the difficult decisions for another day. The Volcker shock makes that much more difficult. They don't lose complete access to the market, to international capital markets after 1980, but it becomes much more difficult for them, and the conditions attached to it become much more stringent as the 1980s progress. And that really comes out of this central decision for the United States economy made in 1979 and 1980.
And Simon, it seems as though the domestic American economic developments play a role in your book. You said a little bit earlier that it had a lot to do with the perceived balance of power and the resurgence of the American economy and its ability to adapt, however imperfectly, to the structural challenges of the 1970s played a big role in that perceived changing balance of power. I'd like you to ask for you to dig a little bit deeper into what those American contributions to the end of the Cold War are. So Fritz is pointing to one very clear economic one. And as a lot of people here know, the question of American contributions to the end of the Cold War is still a very, very political issue, where you have the so-called Reagan Victory School, the triumphalists, who contend that Reagan had a grand strategy meant to apply relentless political, economic, military pressure on the Soviet bloc, and that worked. To those on the other side of the spectrum who are all about the Gorby mania and suggest that it's the reason the Cold War ended, started, and stopped with Gorbachev. So as you've gone through the archival materials available in the Reagan Library as well as elsewhere, looked at archival material in Europe and the Soviet Union, where are we in terms of evaluating the role of the United States in the end of the Cold War?
So let me actually answer the question not by focusing on what one might find at the Reagan Library, but rather what one might find at various locations in the former Eastern Bloc, former Soviet Union, because I think that has some more explanatory power, right? You can find huge quantities of paper in any presidential administration's records, which reassure themselves that they're doing exactly the right thing and that correlation absolutely equals causation, which we know isn't always the case. So let me shift the focus east, if you will. There's some really interesting material which gives us some sense of this. The first kind of big takeaway is that we shouldn't just discount Carter. There's a lot of material from the former Warsaw Pact archives, which very much frames Carter as having reinvigorated the Cold War. I think Susie's point about not using the term Second Cold War is an extremely important one, but there is a qualitative change which is starting to happen in about 1977 or so in American defense spending, for which Reagan gets a lot of the credit, but which does really start up under Carter, and also on issues like human rights and the kind of ideological component of the Cold War, if you will. So actually, when Reagan gets elected, there's a lot of reporting in various Eastern Bloc countries that frames this as good news. Because Carter was zigzagging, according to some diplomats. He was overly ideological and not a rational realist, whereas Reagan would be, which is a very interesting prediction to be making. A lot of ink is spilled about how Reagan on the campaign trail won't really be the Reagan of the Reagan in the White House, because he's just saying this stuff, but he's really kind of in the pocket of big business, and they're not. This is, I think I'm paraphrasing Yuri Andropov, who's head of the KGB at the time, but of course goes on to be leader of the Soviet Union after Leonid Brezhnev dies in November '82, where Andropov says something to the effect of, they're not building factories and mansions just to destroy them. So the first big takeaway, I think, is that we need to expand it out a little bit to include some of the Carter years. And so while I shorthand talk about my book as starting in '80, it really picks up in kind of '76. If I'm very honest, it's just it's a little bit more superficial on that tail end there. The other big takeaway, and then of course the best, one of the, I get asked the question a lot, what was one of the most surprising things you ever found in an archive? And one of the ones I always point to is a Central Committee foreign policy document from 1985, which says that the first Reagan term was meaningfully no different to what the second Carter term would have looked like had Carter won in 80 as opposed to Reagan, all the way down to SDI. And this gets me to the second point. And I think I'm echoing some of what Chris said, which is the technological revolution in military affairs, which is happening in the 1980s. So first of all, the Reagan buildup is not happening during a time of plenty, right? There's a major recession in the United States. There's a little uptick after Reagan comes into office, but then there's a couple of years there of pretty bad news for the American economy. It's good news in the long run because, as Fritz talked about, interest rates are high, which attracts capital to the United States, which is beneficial for the American economy. But none of this is happening at a time of plenty. So when you look at something like SDI, it's not as if the Reagan administration really had huge amounts of cash to throw around on this unless they wanted to print it, which was not in the cards. So SDI matters less for space-based lasers and all of the very cool stuff that earns it its Star Wars moniker. But what SDI spoke to was the technological capabilities of the United States industrial plant. Right. And that was something that the Soviet Union, as Chris just said, couldn't meaningfully replicate. There's a wonderful line in a conversation between Nikolai Agarkov, who's the head of the Soviet General Staff, their equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and a New York Times, I think, journalist, where he says something to the effect of, in your country, children play with computers. In our country, we don't have enough computers for all of the offices at the Ministry of Defense. Which triggers a massive military reform that Agarkov gets going and which really actually only comes to fruition in 2008 and afterwards in Russia. But it was the integration of technology and network-centric warfare that's enshrined in the US doctrine of air-land battle, which becomes the defining sort of military doctrine for the Army operationally and also by implicitly the rest of the force in the mid-1980s, which is all about kind of aerospace blitzkrieg warfare enabled by the proliferation of sensors on the battlefield and the networking of their tactical elements down to a very, 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 very low level. That is to say, individual vehicles or squads. So that's a product of the American economy. In many ways, and product of the kind of the technological changes that are underway in the 1980s, which are not harnessable by the Soviet Union, I would say. And then the third big element, I think, in all of this, which does redound to Reagan's credit, I think, is the ideological stroke human rights element of this. And the extent to which I think Reagan framed the Cold War not as a big misunderstanding, not as a sort of vanilla contest for power between two great powers, but rather that he framed it in a very kind of Manichaean right versus wrong sense. And I'm not weighing in on the accuracy of that, but I think it's fair to say that that was a really powerful motivator. And I think I would say that from the Eastern Bloc archives, we have a lot of evidence of that resonating, for example, as Fritz just talked about, in Eastern Europe, and not being the cause of the revolutions of 1989, but also not being irrelevant to events that happened later.
Thanks very much. And Susie, if we can stay on the topic of the Western contributions, and as Simon points out, there's a lot to be gained by looking at the Western contribution through the lens of Eastern Bloc archives. But the end of the Cold War reflected obviously not just the collapse of the Soviet bloc, but also something that I think is often taken for granted, and that's the ability of the West, particularly the transatlantic community, to hold together. And then, just as today, the transatlantic community seems to be in perpetual crisis. But at the end of the day, the West was able to hold together in a way that the East was not. So based on your research, what were the instruments that allowed that to happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that something that has really framed my own work thinking about the rise and fall of the Euro missiles story from its origins all the way back to the 1950s through the end of the Cold War has been about the roads not taken, right? What if things had turned out differently, and why did they end up turning out the way that they did? And so something that I have come away from my own research with is just an appreciation for how lucky NATO got. I think, so there's a great line from Gregory Treverton, who served on the National Security Council in the Carter administration in 1991, I believe, where Treverton says that essentially the Cold War was a race to the bottom. And what saved the Western Allies was that the Soviet Union got to the bottom first, right? But that, and I say this, right, not to say that there weren't obvious strengths of the Western Alliance in the 1980s, but that because we know how the Cold War ended, it is easy to overinflate those strengths and diminish the very serious weaknesses that were facing the alliance in the 1980s. And I'll zero in on one of them because I think it's probably the biggest problem that the Allies face. So in December of 1979, the Western Allies decide on a two-pronged decision, what they call the dual track decision, to, so on one hand, negotiate with the Soviet Union for reductions on what were then called theater nuclear forces, but these are just nuclear weapons in Europe, right? Land-based nuclear weapons in Europe, to try to remove the Soviet deployments of the SS-20s that had started earlier in the decade. And the second track of this decision is that NATO decides that they will deploy a series of new weapons of their own, the ground-launched cruise missiles, the Glickums or Griffins, and then the Pershing II ballistic missiles. So there's a clear intersection between the technological dimensions that Chris and Simon are talking about here, and that the Pershing II and the ground-launched cruise missile are both high technology, right, using GPS mapping. These are things made possible by the revolutions in military technology in the 1970s and scare the Soviets as a result. But they also, the prospect that NATO is going to deploy these weapons also terrifies their own citizens. And so in the early 1980s, you have massive demonstrations, right? In all across West Germany, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Italy, in Turkey, in Canada, in the United States, just record setting, right? There's one demonstration in The Hague where 550,000 people come out. The Netherlands is not that big in 1983. That is a lot of Dutch people who are concerned about the prospect that stationing these new missiles in their midst is going to lead to nuclear war, right? And if we think about the 1980s culturally, this is everywhere, right? War games or The Day After, 99 Red Balloons. There's this moment of nuclear fear and anxiety. Now, NATO, despite this broad and very diverse public opposition, manages to see the deployments of the Pershing IIs and ground-launched cruise missiles through, starting in 1983. But there is a fundamental change that has taken place across the West. And in foreign ministries and defense ministries and intelligence agencies, from Washington to London to Bonn, reams of paper worrying about the democratization of security questions, right? And that voters across the alliance had fundamentally lost an appetite for a nuclear defense. And for NATO, that is the beginning of the end, right? If your voters will not sustain the expenditures necessary, but also are not willing to live alongside nuclear weapons, then everything about how NATO's defenses, right, the extended deterrent from the United States had worked could be unraveled. And so there is this constant fear all the way up until the summer of 1989, particularly focused on the prospect that the West Germans might decide that they were done with nuclear weapons, right? That they didn't want to live with them, And the signing of the INF Treaty in December 1987, right, heralded as this big breakthrough in superpower relations, actually makes this feeling all the more acute in Germany, because the missiles that are remaining, right, the INF Treaty gets rid of everything between 500 kilometers and 5,500 kilometers, but there's these pesky short-range missiles that are left under 500 kilometers. And the Germans of all political persuasions start to fixate on this. And the sort of popular rallying cry, it's incredibly morbid, is the shorter the range, the deader the German. And so there's this concern that the Germans will simply vote for a government that will no longer sustain this. And so ultimately, right, we know that the revolutions in Eastern Europe, the transformations of 1989 and 1990 sweep this question away. But in the summer of 1989, they're not so sure. And Brent Scowcroft writes this incredible memo to George H.W. Bush at the time, saying that unless the Soviet Union collapses, Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, an American ally, will be the biggest single threat to US interests in the 1990s.
That's quite interesting. And Chris, and of course, if, we do know that the Soviet Union did collapse shortly thereafter. And so, it might be a good way of ending a couple rounds of questions before we turn to maybe future directions in Cold War scholarship. And one of the questions that's often posed about the collapse of the Soviet Union is, could it have been avoided? Could they have taken perhaps a Chinese path, which retained the political monopoly, but introduced pretty significant market mechanisms? So based on your research, and you've done quite a lot of archival work that and introduced scholars to a number of important documents on this issue, what is your read? Was that a possibility?
Yeah, my view in looking at the documents that we've got from the late 1980s is that a quote unquote Chinese path in terms of market economics plus political centralization wasn't plausible for a number of reasons. One is that the Soviet Union was in a very, very different place from China economically. And so economic growth was just harder because the Soviet Union was already substantially richer than China. China was suffering from 25 years of Mao's misrule. And so almost anyone put in charge of China, if they just done nothing, would have presided over growth for at least a couple of years. All you needed to do is not be Mao and you got some growth. So it wasn't that easy in the Soviet Union. And the second thing was that the Soviet bureaucracy, which was the same thing as the Soviet managerial class, had become ossified and was opposed to the types of changes that you'd need to get growth, as I mentioned before. So those two factors meant that a shift towards a new economic system was only plausible if you'd had a big political shift too. And that's what Gorbachev didn't realize fully at first, and he came only to fully make sense of as he passed through his time in office and became more radical in political terms as well as in economic terms. But I think it's a different question to ask, could the Soviet Union have survived? Because there I think the answer is yes. And I think it's easy to imagine a circumstance where the Soviet Union had turned down the temperature of competition with the United States, perhaps even let a couple of the countries of Eastern Europe go free, but retained the monopoly of political power at home precisely by not changing anything. If Andropov had lived to be 110, I think the Soviet Union wouldn't have collapsed. Now, I don't buy the thesis that it would have become a rich country along Chinese lines either. But I think there's no reason to think that the political system was primed for collapse. And I think even Gorbachev, until very late in his time in power, could very easily have applied a relatively small amount of political violence at home and kept the Union together. I think all he needed to do was kill around 1,000 people in 1989, as late as 1989, to keep the pro-independence movements at bay. You only got the independence movements in the Baltics and then in Georgia and elsewhere. It became clear that Gorbachev was only willing to kill up to a couple dozen, which is what we got. Any higher tolerance for violence, I think, would have succeeded in keeping the Union together. And I wouldn't have advised them to do that, but I think it's worth considering the counterfactual that many people in Russia today wish had been undertaken, which is that you'd had a bit stronger of a hand at the center, which means a bit more tolerance for political violence. I think they're right to say that could have kept the Union together in terms of keeping all of the constituent republics, even the Baltic states, within the Soviet Union. And so in that sense, I don't think the collapse of the Soviet Union was inevitable at all. I think it was very much a deliberate decision by Gorbachev not to use the violence it would have taken. And I think it's sort of interesting for him as a leader. Leaders of big empires regularly take decisions that kill thousands, tens of thousands, often even millions of people, which is sort of par for the course if you're running a big empire of any sort. And Gorbachev wasn't willing to do that, which I think is certainly interesting in terms of understanding his personality and his politics. And the fact that he wasn't willing to do it is why so many Russians criticize him today.
Thanks very much. I'd like to ask, before we turn to questions from the audience who've been waiting rather patiently, just one final question to each of the panelists. And knowing that we have quite a number of undergraduates who are contemplating senior theses, masters and PhD students who are probably knee-deep in their preparations for writing the dissertations. I'm wondering if I might ask each of you where you see the trajectory of scholarship in the end of the Cold War going. Where do you see the big unanswered questions? What are the big trend lines that you see? The untapped archives or untapped questions that aspiring Cold War scholars might be interested in knowing. And maybe Fritz, will start with you.
Yeah. Well, there's much work to be done. So I think we are really still at the tip of the iceberg in many ways. I think the way I like to think about it is trying to connect these kind of broad structural forces that we have been discussing in some ways with the discrete events of the late 1980s that comprise the end of the Cold War. I think there's a lot of work left to be done, and that's what archival documents can tell you, is exactly how those two end up connected. I think we have some great hypotheses. I think all of our work on this panel is attempting to do that in certain ways. But whether it's Western archives, Eastern archives, much remains to be discovered precisely so that we can, whether it's economics, human rights, security issues, how exactly all of these broad structural factors translated into discrete events, which means connecting individual agents, which particular people, which particular institutions were the most important in producing the outcomes that we saw. I think many of those questions in both East and West remain to be seen. So as a personal person who studies economic issues, I would advocate that everyone continue to join me and Michael and Chris and others in trying to understand the political economy of the late Cold War, because I think it's a vitally important and still relatively understudied realm. But it's really true across the board that whatever your interest is, there's much that remains to be done.
Simon?
I think there's a few elements to this. So as Fritz said, I think very accurately, this is kind of right on the coalface of what's doable in terms of available materials. So in that vein, my first comment is not going to be especially helpful, and that's the intelligence component of a lot of this, on which we're still waiting for declassification beyond some pretty spotty materials. That being said, on issues like, for example, long-range intelligence, there's actually a lot that's out there on sort of big estimates about future trajectories. A lot of the primary sources have been accessible since the very early 2000s, and are, for example, fully open at the National Archives, even if some of the folks there do dissuade people from working on those historical topics. I've had similar experiences to you, Michael. But that stuff's actually wide open on forecasting the Soviet economy, forecasting Soviet strategic forces. There's a lot of really great stuff that's available. A lot of it's actually online too. The other element that people, I think there's a ton of work to do is in kind of the military history, the revolution in military affairs. And on this, the saving grace is the RAND Corporation, whose studies on the Soviet military are accessible at a huge proportion of libraries. I bet Indiana has a vast run of these RAND reports on the state of the Soviet military done under Project Army or Project Air Force. I know at Duke we do. They don't get checked out a lot. A huge proportion of them are just in my office. But there's actually a lot of raw material for some pretty serious study of the kind of RMA and the evolution of the Soviet military alongside the American, the Ogarkov reforms, et cetera. There's a lot that can be done on that. The third point is, I think, at least, that would be very interesting to me, is work that focuses not just on the superpowers, right, but that uncovers the agency of US and Soviet allies. And I think that there's a lot that you can do, in large part because I have found, at least, that their archives are vastly more open than those of the superpowers. In this case, the fact that the DDR or Czechoslovakia ceased to exist is a huge boon to historians, as non-existent states tend to be less worried about the national security consequences of declassification. So I think there's a lot of room for work that uncovers the agency of smaller powers in this story, which is not incorrectly, but perhaps incompletely told as primarily a superpower story.
Susie?
Yeah, I want to take your question and flip it on its head a little bit, because I wonder what we are not studying if we are focused mostly on explaining the end of the Cold War. And so I'd like to think about how we could focus on the late Cold War as a period, not just a prelude, the sort of appetizer course for what we know is coming later. I would particularly be interested in seeing more work on nuclear policy and nuclear relations. And I mean that both between Moscow and Washington, but also between within both of the alliances. I think there's still ample opportunities for work on strategic arms control. So I know that might sound crazy. We know a lot about SALT I and the initial negotiations there, but we don't know nearly as much as we might about SALT II and how it intersects with all of these technological and military evolutions that were taking place in the 1970s. And then, of course, I think I would love to see, as the archives open, a detailed treatment of the START negotiations. I think that there's a lot there to be written. I also think there are some opportunities for much more detailed work about the nuclear dimensions of the Warsaw Pact's internal relations, particularly in the 1980s. So I've done a lot of work on the NATO side of things. And as I have done that and don't have space to do the Warsaw Pact in one 100,000 word book, I barely fit everything in that 100,000 words as it is, the kinds of things that I came back to regularly that I wished I could read and cite were about, say, something in depth on the so-called counter deployments that followed the Soviet decision to walk out of the INF talks in Geneva in late 1983. So not just about the Soviet thinking behind this new round of missile deployments, but also the deliberations between Warsaw Pact allies about the benefits and risks of even doing this counter deployment, and the attitudes of the missiles hosts like Czechoslovakia and the German Democratic Republic. And I don't just mean that at a political level, but we know that there were, public expressions of discontent about these counter deployments in both Czechoslovakia and the GDR. And I would be really interested to read about those kinds of things. But coming back, I guess, to the idea of the end of the Cold War in particular, I think that the scholarship is already taking us towards a more nuanced place, right? Considering it not just as a moment, but as a process, right? Not unlike the scholarship on the origins of the Cold War and the way the historiography developed in the 1980s. I'm thinking in particular of Lawrence Luthie's recent book, Cold Wars. It disaggregates them regionally, but I think Luthie is among many. And so as archives open, I would like to see a little bit more that looks at the sort of transitional moment, right? Bridging from the late 1980s into the early 1990s, and maybe not so narrowly sliced that it's just about 1989 and 1990 or just to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but really following some of the trends that bridged the Cold War into the post-Cold War period.
Chris?
I agree with everything that's been said thus far, and so it's hard to go last after those three suggestions. But I'll give two more. I think one is writing the history of the late 1980s from the perspective of East Asia, where the end of the Cold War just doesn't make sense as a framing, whether in Tokyo or in, especially in Beijing or anywhere else. Yes, it's true that Soviet foreign policy retrenched, but that was far from the most important thing happening in the region. And so I think if you step out of Berlin or out of Prague and step into Tokyo or Seoul or anywhere else, that framing is just nonsensical. And I think we've only begun to understand that. Second thing I think is taking technology more seriously, and this fits with what Simon was saying about military affairs. I think it's more generalizable even than that, because it has a civilian component as well. And understanding why it was that the Soviet Union, which everyone thought in the 1960s was catching up technologically, by the 1980s was so clearly far behind in the things that actually mattered. And I think this is somewhere where the archives are all wide open in Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union. And you can get a pretty clear sense of the decision-making of what was going on, what wasn't going on, more importantly, and then trace this directly into the revolution and military affairs that happened in the West and didn't happen in the Soviet Union. I think that's of fundamental importance, and we're only just beginning to make sense of that.
Well, thank you to all for rather illuminating and inspirational comments for future directions about where this scholarship is going. And so we're just a couple minutes behind, which I think is not too bad in terms of transitioning to questions from the audience. And I'm a bit overwhelmed by the response so far. Michael Goodman has been waiting rather patiently, and so maybe he can start us off with his first question. Wasn't there a period post-1975 when it actually appeared as if the Soviet Union was winning the Cold War? So maybe we'll just open it up to perceptions of where the Cold War was going in the 1970s.
Yes, very much so. I mean, this is a common viewpoint in Moscow in the very early 80s, which is not to say that they were ignorant of their problems. What's striking is the extent to which many leaders in the US, I mean, Reagan, if you look at Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign, it's not morning again in America, right? It's midnight. It's scary. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is that there were various kind of factors in the so-called correlation of forces, which led a lot of people on both sides of the Iron Curtain to come to take roughly that view, and then, of course, revise that over the coming half decade.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that, just to say something specifically about 1975 and kind of the hinge that's happening in this moment, is you see a whole bunch of developments right around 1975 that all contribute to this newfound sense of pessimism in the West that the Soviets are outstripping them. And so part is about just a general sense of malaise and anxiety about whether the United States was even willing to be a superpower anymore in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate. You also have growing Soviet adventurism, as the term of the day would have been. Angola is obviously the example that many turn to. And so 1975, between these developments and then the signing of the Helsinki Final Act, right, this is really where you see a big uptick in outright critiques of détente as it had been pursued by Nixon and Kissinger in particular. And so this is when you get a really strong, diverse constellation of critics of détente who argue that it's a bad deal and that the West had been taken advantage of. And so there really is this sense of negative anxiety in the West about where they are relative to the Soviet Union.
If I could add to one thing, that I think the striking thing to me, and I agree completely with the trajectory that was just sketched out, is the extent to which American elites changed their view. I mean, if you go back to Kissinger saw his job as managing U.S. decline, and I think it's empirically the case that compared to all Secretary of States in the 20th century, U.S. power declined more under Kissinger than any other, and he was basically resigned to that. Whereas when you get to Carter, sort of counter to what people actually think of as Carter, the view is the opposite. The view is that actually there's new technology that can be applied to the military. actually that you can take Silicon Valley and put it in weapon systems, and this is going to create a revolution in military affairs, which was the strategy. And that was something that was inconceivable in the early 70s, but became supported by bipartisan leaders by the late 70s. And that shift in attitude from accepting equality to trying to regain hegemony, I think was really fundamental in explaining why the Second Cold War started.
So I think with the outpouring of questions, I think we may just have to bounce between the lists with the chat and the participants. So we have a student question. Becca, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. My question is mainly for Mr. Miller because it's something that you said, but anybody, of course, can feel free to jump in on it. So I'm in one of Professor DeGroot's classes, and we talk about how the 20th century was like huge for the rise to importance for oil and and the influence it had in economics and politics and diplomacy and I mean pretty much everything. And so we've just been learning about how even throughout a lot of the Cold War, there were points when the Soviet Union really catered to the Western world, even at their own and their geographical neighbors' expenses, because they really desperately needed certain technologies to develop the oil fields in Western Siberia. So I thought it was really interesting when you said that the Soviets were quite good at replicating technologies. And of course, I'm viewing this through the lens of like this very specific area of Soviet life. But I was wondering what the disconnect was. Like if the Soviets had such a knack for developing their own versions of Western technology, what got in the way of them making their own equipment for developing those oil fields in Western Siberia?
Yeah, and this is a fundamental question of why the Soviets could copy some things really well and not copy others that one might think would be easy to copy. And I think the answer, and I'm working on a book right now on the history of the computer chip in international politics, which is sort of a case study in this. But I think the answer is that manufacturing got vastly more complex over the course of the 20th century, which is sort of obvious, and it became harder and harder to copy advanced manufacturing. And so when you look at the types of things that were cutting edge in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they involved far more parts and far more precision, and the precision is the most important factor than anything that anyone was making in the early 20th century. So the scale at which you needed to be able to manufacture, millimeters and then nanometers, and you're talking about tiny scale, became vastly harder to replicate. So I can give you an example from computer chips, which I know much better than oil drilling technology. In the first computer chips, the designs were carved by hand because the transistors were large enough that you could take a penknife and carve out a design. By the time you get to the 1970s, you had thousands of transistors on a 1 square inch chip. But in the 1980s, you had tens of thousands reaching into the hundreds of thousands. And so it's just impossible to do by hand. You needed extraordinarily accurate chemicals, extraordinarily accurate lenses to shine light that would carve out circuits onto a chip of silicon. And you needed all these different parts to be produced with extraordinary precision. It just became very, very, very difficult to do. And so we put the best manufacturing enterprises together in the Soviet Union, and they just couldn't replicate it. Even when they had the designs, you could steal designs all you wanted, you just couldn't replicate it unless you had the tools and the know-how. And that became just harder and harder to do across a larger and larger share of advanced manufacturing as the 20th century went on.
All right, thank you so much.
We have another question in the chat, which seems like a really fundamental one to the topic we're discussing. Are there any indications in the documents in the archives that the Soviet leadership wanted to stop the arms race in order to spare the domestic economy?
Very much so. So I think there's a lot of evidence from the Gorbachev years, which are probably best known, where Gorbachev is actually fairly explicit in his dealings with Reagan and with others about the sense that spending vast quantities of money on not just the existing arms race, but on the new paths that it might take, inspired by SDI, it's not something that he wants to do, and that he wants to invest money in improving the domestic economic sector. And I think Chris has summed up really well the cash-intensive problems which there were in the Soviet domestic economy. But I also see the same running through Konstantin Chernenko, Gorbachev's immediate and brief predecessor, Yuri Andropov, who led the Soviet Union for a couple of years before Chernenko, after Brezhnev, and also under Brezhnev as well, that there's an impetus to basically use space to buy time. That is to say, to get some breathing room in the Cold War arms race competition in order to invest in the Soviet domestic economic sector in such a way that would ultimately redound to the Soviet Union's benefit in Cold War competition. Right? This isn't; these aren't Pacific impulses that I'm talking about necessarily, but there was a strong sense that military-industrial complex was inefficient, was a drain on a lot of the Soviet economy, and that those resources could be better used if diverted, and that substantially predates Gorbachev.
Michael, I might just add, I think another element of why the Soviets, particularly by the 1980s, are interested in stopping this arms race is because they've come to recognize that the Reagan period has opened up vast new quantities of resources for the West itself. And so the kind of financial resources available to the Reagan administration, it becomes clear, are a much larger scale than even the United States, so than even Carter or Nixon in the 1970s viewed as available to them. So the deficit spending that Reagan is able to undertake and continue for many years in the 1980s, it begins to show up in the Soviet archives that this will, although it's still a matter of debate in Congress, how much money can be spent, the Soviets have begun to conclude that clearly the United States has much more money to throw at the problem and has kind of opened a new frontier in its own resources that the Soviet Union will not be able to match. And so it's another reason why they become interested in trying to halt this arms race.
Maybe a question from the list. Kit, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So I was particularly struck by what Mr. Miller mentioned, or Professor Miller, about the Soviet Union could have survived the late 1980s by just killing around 1,000 people. What struck me as interesting that isn't that what Russia has been doing throughout its history, especially towards the end of the Tsarist regimes? I mean, in a way, with nuclear weapons in play now, could we think of Gorbachev's decision to allow revolution to happen within the Soviet Union as a way to, in a way, provide more stability and give Russia a head start in the rebuilding process? I mean, with nuclear weapons involved, this is particularly important since we don't want any rogue states acquiring nuclear weapons and actually using them, which I'm opening this question up to everyone, so.
Well, I'll try to give it, and I think that, so you're right that there's been political violence applied in Russia, but I think that's true in every country to differing degrees. So it's just a question of what degree is applied at what time. And I think the level of political violence that you need to apply to hold on to power if you're a political leader changes based on the context. So, if you wanted to take power in Russia in 1918 amid the revolution, you'd have had to apply a lot of political violence just because there were a lot of people with guns running around. If you wanted to hold power near Brezhnev in 1965, everyone was pretty happy with you, so you didn't need to do much at all. You could lock up Sakharov, and that was kind of enough. Gorbachev, I think, had a really strong hold on power his first couple of years in office. And when the first independence or autonomy movements emerged in the Caucasus and the Baltics, it seems to me that all you need to have done is just use a bit of violence against them, as a bit of violence was in fact used in Tbilisi in '89 to shut that down. Now, whether that's a good idea or not is a different question. I think that's just an empirical judgment of what it would have taken to stop the independence movements. And I think you're right that Gorbachev believed that wasn't the right priority to place on politics, that it wasn't worth preserving the Soviet Union at any cost. He wasn't willing to use much violence at all to preserve it, and he felt that the Union as a whole would be better off if it moved to a type of politics that used less violence in practice. And the tragedy, of course, is that what followed Gorbachev wasn't actually substantially less violent. You had violence used in different ways, and it was less centrally directed, at least at first. So we can argue whether the result was better than the practice of politics under Gorbachev. But it's I think certainly the case that had he been more willing to use violence, he could have prevented some of the forces that were pulling the Soviet Union apart.
And a question from the chat, we have, how do you think that NATO would have fared in the 1990s if the USSR had not collapsed? Would the United States have had to apply some of the hard pressure on its allies that the Soviet Union could have done in order to keep the alliance together?
I mean, it's an interesting question, right? Because so much of how the 1990s evolved is at NATO a story about dealing with Russia post the Soviet Union. So there's a huge counterfactual avenue here that opens up many of its own little mini avenues that we could consider. But I think that if we think about this, the state of affairs at NATO in the late 1980s, I mean, some of the problems that Fritz sketched out that are facing the Soviet Union in the 1980s with its allies are also happening in the West. We just call it by different names. I mean, right, Fritz used the phrase, the material burden of allies increases. NATO just calls that burden sharing, right? And then you have an argument about how much Congress is willing to pay based on the general political contours of the debt, right? And this is an issue we all know well if we look at you open a news outlet now, right? There are some problems at NATO that are enduring. And I think, you know, if I think about the work of someone like Tim Sale, who recently published a history of NATO throughout the Cold War, that those continuities, right? That there are just underlying patterns of tension, and that so much of NATO's history, even in the Cold War, right? We think about it as an institution designed to face off against the Soviet Union, but so much of NATO's history is about internal tension that I can see many sources of continuity that would have happened if the fate of the Soviet Union had turned out to be different in the 1990s. Many of them based around internal issues about burden sharing and how to sort of share that. And then obviously the extension of some of the internal weaknesses and problems with public opinion and public support that I mentioned earlier, those would have endured in the 1990s.
John Dare?
Yes, hi. So if we look at the Cold War in the context being a competition between two economic models, the free market capitalists and the centrally controlled Soviet-style socialists, my question is to anybody who wants to answer, was it the flaws of the Soviet economic model or the strengths of the capitalist economic model that had a bigger impact on the way that the Cold War ultimately played out, and especially in the end towards the late Cold War?
I'm happy to give it a shot. So thanks, John, for your question. So I titled my book, The Triumph of Broken Promises, because I view the competition between these two systems and the economic crises brought about by the 1970s as one of trying to, what both sides have to do is figure out how to impose various forms of economic discipline or austerity on their own people, basically reorganize their economies in ways that will cause severe economic dislocation for many different types of people. If you're an industrial worker in the Midwestern United States, or if you are reliant on a system of fixed prices within the Eastern Bloc, these types of economic agreements, whether formal or informal, that had emerged in the first decades of the Cold War, have to be rewritten in the 1970s and 1980s because of the kind of new competitive globalized world marketplace that has taken shape during these decades. In addressing those challenges, I suppose we could say that the free market system had strengths in that it was able to impose this kind of discipline on its own societies. That's a certain type of strength. I don't know that it's necessarily a strength to be celebrated, but it is a type of strength that the centralized planning of the state socialist system was unable to accommodate, was unable to bring about without causing severe political crises along with it. So if we think of Poland in the early 1980s, if we think of what is eventually happening in Poland and Hungary and the Soviet Union, what is Gorbachev actually trying to do? What is perestroika? When you look at it closely, in my opinion, it's actually an attempt to introduce various forms of market discipline in a very limited and still not a free market fashion, but a very limited sense within the Soviet Union. For many, many reasons and for many different constituencies, that's a very unpopular and very difficult proposition to try to implement. And ultimately, of course, he's unable to do so. So I think we can say that the strengths, or the characteristics at least, of the free market democratic capitalist system were fundamental to the West prevailing in the Cold War, or the East not being able to continue the Cold War competition. But then we just have to ask ourselves, well, what exactly is that strength? And should we think of it as a strength that is worthy of celebration, or as something that still needs to be corrected even decades later, where we find ourselves now?
Great, thank you so much for that answer.
I noticed in the chat that there are a couple questions to Simon about something you mentioned with human rights. And so maybe I'll just push the two of them together and ask Simon if you could speak broadly about the importance of human rights in international relations, the enduring legacy of the Helsinki Final Act in the late 70s and into the 1980s.
Yeah, so I think there's a few key points to hit here. Apropos of Helsinki, what matters about Helsinki is that the Soviet Union commits to things on paper, right? And thus is accountable in a way that it wasn't necessarily beforehand to what become called, and there are various formulations of this, Helsinki watch groups, Helsinki monitoring groups, etc. And they are able not only to document Soviet abuses of human rights, which are not a new phenomenon, but also directly contrast the violations, if you will, and then also the what they are a violation of, which are the human rights provisions of the Helsinki Final Act. So that's important from a global public opinion standpoint in a few ways. And I think also the other point that I would make on the human rights front is the extent to which it is a rallying cry for individuals seeking to understand the Cold War, right? Especially by the late Cold War period, we're not talking about people who understand this in the context of the immediate aftermath of World War II, right? There's a new generation of people coming into power and certainly coming into voting booths, who don't have a collective memory of World War II, for example. Right, and thus they're looking for a way to make sense of great power competition, which is not a new phenomenon, as they're experiencing it. And I think human rights has a degree of purchase on that younger generation who are now becoming more politically active as a mobilizing force in the Cold War, though I think Susie talked about a few of the challenges that younger generation also presented. So it's not a simple cut and dry story, but those would be the 2 points I would raise most.
Quinn Buckley, go ahead.
Yes, so I think a couple of you mentioned that there's a little bit of a distance between, like in the West, the public and experts on the technological capabilities of the Soviet Union. So is there a particular point where the perception by the public at least began to shift more towards that of the experts, or was that really the perception until the Soviet Union collapsed ultimately?
I'm happy to jump in. I know Simon has done a lot of work on this too, but I think the question is assessing technology is sort of hard in the abstract. I think if you want to assess military tech or like militarily relevant technology, that's that's one thing you can assess. And then there's also different sectors of the economy that one could assess. I think in American public opinion, there was a sense that Sputnik and then the space program, the Cuban Missile Crisis all came together and created this sense that the US was falling behind or had fallen behind. If you actually look at more technical reports from the time, you find a much more nuanced picture even then. But I think what is clear is in the expert community, there was a consensus that grew over the course of the 1980s that in military technology, the US really was leaping ahead, and that consensus congealed first in the Soviet Union, I think, and then only in a sort of belated way did Americans realize what they'd actually stumbled upon when it came to new defense technologies.
I'll just jump in really quickly, echoing what Chris said, a couple of points. First, for example, qualitative measures of power are a lot harder to translate for public consumption than are quantitative ones, right? So if you look at a lot of the writings on nuclear issues, for example, at this time, you see the term throw weight thrown around a lot, which basically just means how many megatons of nuclear bomb either side can get into the sky. That's a theoretical number. So then you kind of drill down, and this is where you start losing people. Well, are those rockets liquid fueled or solid fueled? And if they're liquid fueled nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles have a really nasty habit of blowing up on the launch pad and never actually launching. This was a big problem in the Khrushchev years in particular. And so then, you're getting down into these layers of complexity, which just aren't resonating with people because it's arcane. It's kind of this nuclear actuary kind of stuff. So that I think gives us some purchase on the gap. And then, if you're West Germany, for example, if you're the BND, the West German, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, you know that East German spies are coming into your country under diplomatic cover, buying as many IBM computers as they can, getting them into the embassy, putting them in diplomatic bags, and then getting them back over the Berlin Wall. Like, that's a really big data point that these guys need to do this. That tells you, that has a lot of explanatory power about the state of the Soviet economy, well beyond the computing sector, which was most developed to the extent that it was in East Germany. But how that kind of worked throughout. And there's been some really good actual work done on East German technological espionage, which I think is really relevant here. Again, though, that's information that's privileged information. That's not going to be made public. I think it's when you look, for example, at the state of the Soviet military's performance in Afghanistan, that you start thinking, okay, these folks have really serious problems. And it wouldn't be accurate, I think, to put a fire break between military and civilian technologies. As we know from the American case, there's a huge, I don't know if the correct term is trickle down or spillover or reciprocal or what have you, relationship between the development and the implementation of some of these tools in military context and their civilian applications, as anyone on this call who has a zipper on their clothing or Velcro is proof positive.
Thanks very much. And I'm so sorry to have to turn away so many wonderful questions, but if maybe we can squeeze just one last one in from the chat. And this refers to a term that hasn't come up quite yet in our conversation, and that is Gorbachev's vision of establishing a common European home. So maybe we could ask somebody to explain very quickly what that common European home was all about. And the question's asking, where exactly did the US have a room within this European home?
So the way I like to think about the common European home is Gorbachev trying to secure what the Soviet Union previously had, the status it had within Europe and within the Eastern Bloc, by diplomatic means, where it was while trying to kind of retrench in a military sense. So what he was trying to do was overcome the political divide that had obviously existed on the European continent for a significant amount of time. This was his means of establishing, or at least rhetorically referencing, an organization that would include all of the partners within NATO and the European community and the Warsaw Pact. But really his main problem was that he was never able to take it anything beyond a vision and try to translate it into something that approached reality.
I think though, if I take up the second piece of the question, right, about where the United States, whether the United States and I guess Canada also as the other North American quasi-European power fit in this common European home. I mean, this is something that was a source of much confusion and consternation for Western policymakers, right? I mean, sometimes Gorbachev seemed to hint that, yes, of course, it was going to be this structure that replaced NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and they would dissolve the old alliances and remake things.
Going anywhere with you.
But in other cases, they were explicit. Gorbachev even personally would explicitly invoke the term European in a way that excluded, defined out the United States. And so there's a great instance where Baker and Shevardnadze meet in May of 1989, and Shevardnadze says to Baker, "We Europeans believe X." And so he's speaking for everyone on the continent. And the implication is, of course, that Baker is not European, and that Gorbachev's, the vision that Gorbachev and Shevardnadze have is for, in this particular instance, Europe without short-range nuclear forces, and that Baker is the one trying to foist them back on the continent. So there's a disconnect here about really where the Americans fit in this common European home.
And with that, I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. I'd just like to say thank you once again to our panelists for exploring these complicated issues and helping us understand what the late Cold War was all about. And I'd also like to thank so many of you for showing up. As I said in the introduction, I think it speaks to the very impressive intellectual energy for Russian Eastern European area studies across the university and in multiple departments. And so with that, I'll wish you a very pleasant afternoon and weekend in Bloomington. We have very nice weather, and I hope you have a chance to get out and get out of the house. But with that, we'll have to say adieu.